Something I've started saying a lot is the world of 2023 is completely unimaginable from the perspective of 1973, whether you're looking at women's rights, rights for queer people, you can look at any number of things. But you can also look back in 1973 and say every good thing we have now is because somebody then was starting something, not knowing if they would win, not knowing what it would look like. I know how different the status of women was in this country and throughout the world 50 years ago.
Today, the National Woman's Party lobbies for the 26th Amendment to guarantee women equal rights under the law. That amendment would make women people in a legal sense for the first time. There are women who belonged to the freedom movement, like these SDS girls, until they found that they were expected to make coffee, not policy. Their splinter groups want to change the whole society.
And those women didn't know if they would win. The world has changed remarkably. So if you can imagine, if you can look back from 2023 to see how different the world was in 1973 and how all the good things happened, and yes, a lot of bad things happened, but we did win a bunch of these things. So then I feel like, okay, we cannot look forward to 2073 and say everything's going to turn out great. We know exactly what 2073 will look like, but we can know that just as 2023 was unimaginable 50 years ago, 50 years in the future is both unimaginable and something we can understand how to work towards and understand how what we do now is what will make the world livable. For example, for Thelma's kid, who will be 51 in 2073.
The climate crisis is impacting people, and yet we are still holding conferences.
25-year-old Vanessa Nakate has become the face of climate activism in Africa, a continent impacted by extreme heat waves, drought, and famine.
It is heartbreaking and frustrating because you didn't cause this crisis, but then you are suffering the impacts.
You know, you mentioned the early 70s and also the challenges of media on reporting on constructive change. I mean, certainly we've talked a lot on this podcast about just the incentives of what constitutes a story that gets attention, right? So rising crime rates, spiking crime is a story, declining crime rates is not a story. And the same thing is true about climate and change. So and this then affects how people who are engaged in the urgency of this communicate publicly, right? So the IPCC, which comes out with its reports and is the kind of synthesis of what a lot of scientists around the world are doing, in its public and press release form has gotten increasingly more hyperbolic, because the incentives are you need to make these very extreme statements in order to get notice and get attention, as opposed to some of the things you've just talked about, Rebecca, and you, Thelma, of the changes that are more gradual that have happened over time are not as amenable to notice and headlines. And a lot of the contemporary environmental movement comes out of that 1973 post period, where a lot of people were legitimately had a lot of animosity toward capitalism and the belief that capitalism was a destructive system, that and that is carried through into the contemporary environmental urgency, which is, companies, multinationals, anybody engaged in that system cannot inherently change these arcs until we radically change the system. And that creates its own tension too, about solutions in the midst of a system that may be compromised. And then you have Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, which was a wake-up call to a lot of people, but it also set the tone of what a lot of people think is the way you should talk about these things, with the kind of pounding the table of do something now or we're all screwed.